The emergency beacon cut through space like a scream. David Reed felt his stomach drop as the distress signal reached his ship. He had been a space captain for 15 years, but nothing in his training prepared him for what he was hearing. The message from New Haven Colony played on repeat, each word filled with panic. "This is New Haven calling any Federation ship. We need immediate evacuation. They're here. The White Ones are here. God help us, they're beautiful and terrible. Please hurry." David's hands moved across the control panel without thinking. His ship, the Horizon's Edge, turned toward the distant world. The crew around him worked in tense silence. They all knew the stories. Empty colonies. Missing people. Ships found drifting in space with no crew aboard. The Pale Ones had struck again. Nobody knew where they came from. The first reports came from the Outer Rim 3 months ago. Massive white creatures that looked like dragons from old Earth stories. They moved through space without ships, their crystalline scales catching starlight like broken glass. Wherever they appeared, people vanished. "How long until we reach New Haven?" David asked his navigator. 18 hours at maximum speed," came the reply. "Too long." David knew it was too long. But the Horizon's Edge was already pushing beyond safe limits. In the lower decks, families huddled together. Some were refugees from other worlds. Others were colonists who had lost their homes to the creatures. Everyone aboard understood fear. In the ship's nursery, Helen Morgan rocked her baby daughter to sleep. Lucy was barely 6 months old, too young to understand the danger. Her tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb while chaos spread through the galaxy. Helen hummed a soft lullaby, the same one her own mother had sung years ago on Earth. "Will we make it in time?" Mark Morgan asked quietly. He was the ship's chief engineer, responsible for keeping the engines running at dangerous speeds. His hands were stained with grease and worry lined his face. Helen looked down at their sleeping daughter. "We have to." The hours crawled by like centuries. David barely slept, staying on the bridge and watching the stars. Other ships joined them. Merchant vessels, passenger transports, even a few military cruisers. Nobody wanted to face the Pale Ones alone. When they finally reached New Haven's solar system, David's heart sank. The planet hung in space like a blue jewel, but something was wrong. The orbital stations were dark. No ships moved between the planet and its moons. Worst of all, massive white shapes drifted through the upper atmosphere like clouds. "Count them," David ordered. 12 visible, his tactical officer reported. Each one is roughly the size of a battle cruiser. "They're not attacking the planet. They're just there." David had seen recordings of the creatures before, but seeing them in person stole his breath. They were impossibly graceful, moving through space as if swimming through invisible water. Their wings stretched for kilometers, translucent and shimmering. Ancient eyes the size of shuttle bays watched everything with alien intelligence. "Open a channel to the planet," David said. Static filled the bridge. Then a weak voice came through. "Federation ships, this is New Haven Emergency Command. Most of our population has already evacuated, but we still have about 3,000 people in the main city. The creatures appeared 2 days ago. They haven't attacked, but everyone who gets too close, they just stop responding. We think they're still alive, but they won't move or speak." David felt ice in his veins. This was new. Usually people just disappeared completely. "We're coming down to get you," he replied. "How much time do we have?" "Unknown." The creatures seemed to be waiting for something. The rescue operation began immediately. Smaller ships descended toward the planet while the larger vessels waited in orbit. David took one of the shuttles himself, unable to sit safely in space while people needed help. New Haven's main city looked like a photograph. Buildings stood perfectly intact, but the streets were empty except for scattered belongings. Here and there, people sat motionless on benches or stood frozen in doorways. Their eyes were open but saw nothing. They breathed but did not respond to voices or touch. "It's like they're dreaming," one of the rescue workers whispered. David's team worked quickly, loading the affected people onto stretchers. They weighed almost nothing, as if part of them had already left their bodies. The conscious survivors huddled together in the evacuation zones, too scared to speak above whispers. Above them, the Pale Ones circled like patient hunters. The evacuation took 6 hours. Ships launched from the planet loaded with refugees and the mysteriously affected colonists. David stayed until the very end, making sure no one was left behind. As his shuttle lifted off, he looked back at New Haven one last time. The Pale Ones were descending. They moved as one, 12 massive forms settling onto the planet's surface with impossible gentleness. The ground didn't shake. No buildings fell. They simply landed and folded their enormous wings, watching the retreating Federation ships with those ancient, intelligent eyes. "Sir," his pilot said urgently, "we're getting reports from the other ships." Engine problems across the fleet. David's blood turned cold. The horizon's edge was falling behind, her engines sputtering and failing. Around them, other ships were having similar problems. It wasn't sabotage or attack. The engines were simply wearing out from the desperate rush to New Haven. "How many ships are affected?" David asked. "About half the fleet. The horizon's edge is among the worst hit." David closed his eyes. They were stranded in space with the pale ones below and limited supplies above. Hundreds of families depended on him, including the Morgans and their tiny daughter. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. In the nursery, Lucy Morgan slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her world had changed forever. Outside the porthole, stars wheeled slowly in the darkness, and somewhere behind them, ancient creatures waited with the patience of eons. Patricia Stone had not slept properly in 3 months. Dark circles ringed her eyes as she stared at the holographic display showing the galaxy's outer rim. Red dots marked every location where the pale ones had appeared. The pattern made no sense, but she knew there had to be one. Every military leader in history faced enemies they could understand. Pirates wanted money. Conquerors wanted territory. Even alien species fought for resources or survival. But the pale ones took people and left everything else untouched. They didn't destroy cities or steal technology. They just made populations disappear. "Admiral, Dr. Torres is here for the briefing," her aide announced. Patricia nodded and gestured for the scientist to enter. Michael Torres looked as tired as she felt. He carried a data pad thick with research notes and walked with the heavy steps of a man carrying bad news. "What have you learned?" Patricia asked directly. She had no patience for small talk when entire worlds lived in fear. Michael activated the room's display system. Star charts filled the air between them, showing trade routes, colony worlds, and research stations. "We've analyzed every attack for the past 3 months. The pale ones aren't random. They target specific types of locations." He highlighted several red dots. New Haven had a large population of Betazoid refugees, natural telepaths. The research station at Kepler 7 was studying consciousness transfer. The mining colony on Rigel had hired dozens of empathic healers to help with worker stress. Patricia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "They're hunting psychic abilities." "It appears so." Every location had either natural telepaths, artificial psychic enhancement, or research into consciousness itself. The stronger the psychic presence, the more likely they are to appear. Patricia walked to the window overlooking Starbase Prometheus. Thousands of ships filled the space around the massive station. Refugees, military vessels, and research ships all sought safety in numbers. But if Michael was right, they might be making themselves a bigger target. "How many telepathic species do we have aboard the refugee ships?" she asked. Michael checked his notes. "Over 6,000 individuals across 12 species, plus the research team studying the affected colonists from New Haven." "We're a psychic beacon," Patricia realized. Every telepath in the fleet is broadcasting their location to these creatures. The implications were terrifying. The Federation had always prided itself on diversity, welcoming species with different abilities and gifts. Now that very diversity made them vulnerable to an enemy they couldn't understand or fight. "There's something else," Michael continued. "The affected colonists from New Haven, the ones who became unresponsive, they're not brain dead. Deep scans show their minds are still active, but the patterns are unlike anything we've seen. It's as if they're experiencing something we can't measure." Patricia thought about the reports from the rescue teams. People standing motionless with open eyes, breathing but not responding. They looked peaceful, almost content, but they wouldn't eat or drink without assistance. Medical teams had to care for them like children. "Are they suffering?" she asked. "We don't think so. Their brain chemistry suggests a dreamlike state. Some of our telepathic medical staff report sensing deep calm from them, but they can't make contact. It's as if the affected people are listening to something only they can hear." Patricia pulled up the fleet roster on her personal display. The New Dawn carried nearly 10,000 refugees, including many families with children. Among them were the Morgans, Mark, Helen, and their infant daughter Lucy. The chief engineer had been working around the clock to keep the damaged ships running, while his wife helped in the medical bay. "Have you noticed any patterns in who gets affected?" Patricia asked. "Age, species, psychic ability level?" Michael shook his head. "That's the strangest part. The pale ones seem to affect people randomly. Strong telepaths and normal humans both become unresponsive. Children and adults show the same symptoms. There's no logic to it." Patricia studied the star charts again. Dozens of colonies had been evacuated in the past month as the pale ones spread throughout the outer rim. The Federation was running out of safe places to put refugees, and panic was spreading faster than the creatures themselves. "Admiral," her communications officer's voice came through the intercom. "We're receiving reports from the outer rim. 3 more colonies have gone dark." Patricia closed her eyes. 3 more worlds. Thousands more people either missing or trapped in that strange, unresponsive state. The Federation's greatest enemy wasn't invading their space, it was already here, taking their people one world at a time. "How long before they reach the core worlds?" she asked Michael. "At their current rate of expansion, maybe 6 months, but that assumes they continue moving inward instead of spreading outward. 6 months to find a solution to an enemy that couldn't be fought with weapons or negotiated with through diplomacy." Patricia had commanded fleets against hostile aliens before, but this was different. The Pale Ones weren't trying to conquer or destroy. They were collecting something and nobody knew what or why. "Keep studying the patterns," she told Michael. "There has to be something we're missing. No species, no matter how alien, acts without purpose." After Michael left, Patricia stood alone in her office staring out at the refugee fleet. Somewhere among those ships, families were trying to build new lives after losing everything. Parents told their children bedtime stories and pretended everything would be normal again. She thought about Lucy Morgan, barely walking now according to the reports. The little girl had been born into a galaxy where white dragons stole people away in the night. Her parents probably sang lullabies and played peekaboo, maintaining the illusion of safety while terror crept closer with each passing day. Patricia made a silent promise to that child and all the others like her. The Federation would find a way to stop the Pale Ones. They would understand what drove these creatures and find a way to save the people they had taken. The alternative was too terrible to consider. Outside her window, stars gleamed like points of hope in the darkness. But Patricia knew that somewhere among them, ancient white shapes moved between worlds, patient and purposeful and utterly alien. The galaxy had become a much larger and more dangerous place, and humanity's children would have to grow up in its shadow. The alarm started as a whisper in the walls. Sarah Williams had been a ship captain long enough to know the difference between routine alerts and real danger. This sound made her blood freeze. It was the tone reserved for the worst possible news. She reached the bridge of the new dawn in seconds, her bare feet slapping against the metal decking. The night shift crew looked up at her with wide eyes full of fear. On the main screen, 3 massive white shapes hung in space like impossible dreams. "How did they find us?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer didn't matter. "The Pale Ones were here, and 10,000 refugees were trapped aboard her ship. They appeared 30 seconds ago," her tactical officer reported. "No warning, no energy signatures. They just materialized." Sarah studied the creatures on the screen. Each one was easily twice the size of her ship, their crystalline scales catching and reflecting the light from nearby stars. Wings that looked too delicate to exist in space stretched wide as they slowly circled the refugee convoy. They moved with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Signal the other ships," Sarah ordered. "Full scatter protocol. Everyone for themselves." She watched as the smaller vessels in the convoy broke formation and fled in different directions. Some would escape. Others might not. But keeping the fleet together would only make it easier for the creatures to take everyone at once. The Pale Ones ignored the fleeing ships completely. Their ancient eyes remained fixed on the new dawn, the largest vessel carrying the most people. Sarah felt like a mouse being watched by sleeping cats. "All non-essential personnel to the ship's center," she announced over the intercom. "Emergency bulkheads are sealing now. Medical teams to emergency stations." Throughout the ship, families grabbed their children and ran for the interior sections. The corridors filled with controlled panic as people who had already lost one home prepared to lose another. Parents whispered reassurances they didn't believe while children asked questions that had no good answers. In the nursery, Helen Morgan held 2-year-old Lucy close to her chest. The little girl had been playing with her stuffed dragon when the alarm started. Now she looked around with curious eyes, completely unaware of the danger closing around them. "What's happening, Mama?" Lucy asked in her small voice. "Just a drill, sweetheart," Helen lied. "We're playing a hiding game." Mark Morgan burst into the nursery, his engineer's uniform stained with grease from the emergency repairs he'd been making. "The engines are holding, but barely. If we try to run, we'll tear ourselves apart." Helen felt tears threatening to spill. They had survived the evacuation from New Haven. They had made it through 3 months of fear and uncertainty. Now the creatures had found them anyway, and there was nowhere left to run. Outside the nursery porthole, one of the pale ones drifted closer. Its massive head filled their view, scales shifting from white to pale blue in the starlight. An eye the size of a shuttle bay looked directly at them, and Helen felt something cold touch the edges of her mind. That was when the pressure started. It began as a whisper at the back of everyone's thoughts, a feeling of being watched by something vast and alien. Sarah felt it on the bridge as her crew began to shake and sweat. Throughout the ship, people dropped to their knees as an overwhelming sense of dread filled their minds. The pale ones were not just looking at them. They were reaching into their thoughts. In the medical bay, telepathic healers screamed and collapsed. The ship's counselor, a betazoid named Deanna, pressed her hands to her temples and sobbed as alien thoughts flooded her mind. Whatever the creatures were thinking was too large and strange for normal minds to process. The pressure grew stronger. People throughout the ship began to shut down, their eyes going blank as the same peaceful emptiness that had taken the New Haven colonists spread through the corridors. It moved like a wave, starting from the outer sections and rolling inward toward the ship's heart. But in the nursery, something impossible happened. Lucy Morgan giggled. The sound cut through the overwhelming psychic pressure like a bell ringing in a storm. Helen looked down at her daughter in amazement. While every adult on the ship was fighting off alien thoughts that threatened to steal their minds, Lucy was smiling and reaching toward the porthole. "Pretty," Lucy said, pointing at the massive eye watching them. "Big dragon." Helen felt the pressure in her own mind ease slightly. The crushing fear that had been building suddenly felt less overwhelming. Around them, other people in the nursery began to breathe normally again. Lucy clapped her hands together the way she did when she wanted to play. She made the soft cooing sounds she usually reserved for her favorite toys. Through the porthole, the pale one's massive eyes seemed to focus more intently on the small girl pressing her face against the transparent metal. "She's not afraid," Mark whispered in wonder. Lucy began babbling in her baby language, the happy nonsense sounds that meant she was excited about something. She reached both hands toward the creature outside, making grabbing motions as if she wanted to touch something fascinating just out of reach. On the bridge, Sarah watched her instruments in disbelief. The psychic pressure that had been driving her crew to madness was changing. The readings showed confusion coming from the creatures, as if they had encountered something they didn't expect. One of the pale ones moved closer to the nursery section of the ship. Its great head tilted to one side, mirroring Lucy's curious expression. The other two creatures stopped their circling and hung motionless in space, their attention focused on whatever was happening near the small porthole. Lucy laughed again, a pure sound of delight that seemed to puzzle the ancient beings watching her. While 10,000 people cowered in fear throughout the ship, one small human child looked at the creatures that had terrorized the galaxy and saw something wonderful. For the first time since the pale ones had appeared in Federation space, one of them had encountered a mind that didn't recoil in terror. Instead of fear, they found curiosity. Instead of resistance, they found welcome. The standoff continued, but something fundamental had changed. The hunters had become the puzzled, studying a prey that refused to behave like prey should. Lucy Morgan was having the best day of her short life. The big white creatures outside her window were the most beautiful things she had ever seen, even prettier than the pictures in her storybooks. Their scales sparkled like the ice crystals Mama showed her in the freezer, and their eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. While everyone else on the ship whispered and cried, Lucy pressed her face against the cool porthole and tried to get the dragons to play with her. She had been trying to get their attention for what felt like hours, and finally one of them was looking right at her. "Hi," she said loudly, waving both hands. "Hi, dragon." The creature's massive head tilted further to one side. Lucy giggled and tilted her own head to match. When the dragon straightened up, she did the same. It was like the mirror game Daddy played with her sometimes, except this mirror was as big as a building and floating in space. Helen Morgan watched her daughter in amazement and terror. The psychic pressure that had been crushing everyone's minds was still there, but it felt different now. Instead of overwhelming fear, there was something that almost felt like curiosity. "She's talking to it," Helen whispered to Mark. "That's impossible," Mark replied, but his voice was uncertain. "She's just a baby." Lucy clapped her hands and bounced in her mother's arms. The pale one outside responded by spreading its enormous wings wider, creating a display of crystal and starlight that made Lucy squeal with delight. She reached toward the creature with both hands, making the grabbing motions that meant she wanted to touch something. Throughout the ship, people began to notice the change. The crushing mental pressure was still there, but it no longer felt like an attack. Dr. Torres, who had been studying the creatures for months, stumbled through the corridors toward the nursery where the readings were strongest. "The psychic emanations are changing," he reported to anyone who would listen. "They're still broadcasting, but the frequency is shifting. It's like they're trying to tune into something." Sarah Williams felt the difference on the bridge. Her crew was no longer collapsing in terror. They looked confused and unsettled, but they could function. Whatever was happening in the nursery section was affecting the entire encounter. "Can you isolate the source of the change?" she asked her science officer. "It's coming from Section C, Deck 7, the nursery level." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear. The nursery level where dozens of families kept their youngest children safe. If the creatures were focusing on the children, she ran through the corridors, pushing past refugees who stood in doorways staring at nothing. The affected people from earlier attacks were beginning to move again, their blank expressions giving way to confusion as if they were waking from deep dreams. When Sarah reached the nursery, she found a crowd gathered around one of the portholes. Parents and children alike stared out at the pale one that hung in space just meters away. But instead of terror, she saw wonder on their faces. At the center of the crowd, Lucy Morgan was putting on a performance. The 2-year-old clapped her hands in rhythm, bouncing in her mother's arms as she sang nonsense songs to the creature outside. Every time she made a sound, the pale one's mental emanation shifted slightly, as if it was trying to understand her language. "Big dragon," Lucy announced proudly, pointing at the creature. "Nice dragon. Want to play?" The pale one's massive eye focused more intently on the small girl. Through the ship's sensors, Dr. Torres could measure the creature's attempts to modulate its psychic broadcast. It was trying to communicate without causing the fear response that had defined every previous encounter. "She's teaching it," Dr. Torres whispered in amazement. "The child is teaching it how to talk to us." Lucy held up her stuffed dragon, a small toy that looked almost comical next to the real thing outside. She made the toy dance in the air, bouncing it up and down while making whooshing sounds. The pale one watched every movement with ancient intelligence. Then something incredible happened. The creature began to move in response to Lucy's game. Its massive form shifted through space with impossible grace, rising and falling in gentle motions that mirrored the toy dragon's dance. Lucy shrieked with laughter and made her toy move faster. The pale one kept pace, its kilometer-long body flowing through space like a ribbon in the wind. "It's playing with her," Helen said in disbelief. The other 2 pale ones moved closer, drawn by whatever was happening between their companion and the small human. Their mental emanations grew stronger but more controlled, no longer the crushing psychic storm that had driven people to madness. Lucy seemed to sense their attention. She turned toward each creature in turn, waving and babbling greetings in her own private language. Each time she spoke, the creature's emanations shifted, as if they were learning to recognize individual sounds and meanings. "The frequency modulation is becoming more precise," Dr. Torres reported, his instruments tracking the changes in real time. "They're learning to communicate on levels that don't trigger our fear responses." Sarah watched in fascination as humanity's first contact with the pale ones unfolded through the innocent games of a toddler. Lucy showed no fear because she had no experience of things that should be feared. To her, the creatures were just very large, very pretty animals that wanted to play. The largest pale one moved even closer to the porthole. Its massive eye filled the entire view, and Lucy laughed with pure joy as she saw her own reflection multiplied in its crystalline facets. She pressed both hands against the transparent metal and made kissing sounds. the way she did when she wanted to show affection. The creature's mental emanation changed again, becoming something that felt almost like warmth. Throughout the ship, people began to relax as the alien presence in their minds shifted from threatening to merely strange. "Hello," Lucy said clearly, one of her newest words. "Hello, dragon." For the first time in the galaxy's recorded history, one of the Pale Ones attempted to respond in a way that wouldn't terrify its audience. The psychic emanation that reached every mind on the ship carried a single simple concept: greeting. It was crude and overwhelming, like being shouted at by someone who didn't know how to whisper. But it was unmistakably an attempt at communication. The ancient beings that had spread fear across the galaxy were trying to say hello to a human child who had reached out to them without reservation. Lucy clapped her hands in delight, understanding on some level that her new friends were talking back to her. She bounced in her mother's arms and pointed excitedly at each creature in turn, chattering away in baby talk as if she was introducing them to her family. The impossible had become real. First contact between humanity and the Pale Ones was happening in a nursery, mediated by a 2-year-old girl who saw wonder where everyone else saw terror. The breakthrough came during Lucy's afternoon nap. While the 2-year-old slept peacefully in her mother's arms, Dr. Torres worked frantically to understand what made her different from every other person in the galaxy. His instruments showed patterns in her brain, activity that defied everything he knew about human development. Her neural pathways are still forming, he explained to the crowd of scientists and officials who had gathered in the ship's main laboratory. Adult brains have established patterns for processing fear, survival instincts, and threat recognition. Lucy's brain hasn't developed those filters yet. Sarah Williams stood at the back of the room, watching the data streams that showed the ongoing communication between Lucy and the Pale Ones. Even while sleeping, the child seemed to maintain some kind of connection with the creatures. They remained positioned near the ship, no longer threatening but clearly waiting for something. "So she's not afraid because she doesn't know she should be afraid?" Sarah asked. "It's more complex than that," Dr. Torres replied. Her developing brain processes the creature's psychic emanations as something closer to music than mental intrusion. Where we hear screaming alarms, she hears a lullaby. Admiral Stone's voice crackled through the communication system from Starbase Prometheus. "Doctor, are you telling me that these creatures have been trying to communicate all along?" Dr. Torres pulled up recordings from previous encounters. "Look at the pattern analysis. What we interpreted as psychic attacks were actually attempts at making contact. The creatures broadcast on frequencies that trigger panic in developed minds, but they're not doing it intentionally." The recordings showed the same rising and falling psychic patterns in every encounter. Now that Dr. Torres knew what to look for, he could see the attempts at communication hidden within what had seemed like random alien thoughts. "It's like trying to have a conversation with someone who screams every time you speak," he continued. The Pale Ones couldn't understand why every species they encountered fled in terror. They were as frustrated as we were. Sarah thought about the missing populations, the empty colonies, the people found in catatonic states. What happened to all the people who disappeared? Based on the brain patterns we're seeing in the affected individuals, I believe they were overwhelmed by direct psychic contact. The creatures were trying to communicate more intensely, not realizing they were essentially shouting into minds that couldn't handle the volume. Helen Morgan listened from her seat near the porthole where Lucy continued to sleep. Outside, the 3 Pale Ones maintained their vigil, their massive forms moving in slow hypnotic patterns. Every few minutes, one of them would turn toward the nursery section, as if checking to make sure their small friend was still there. "Are the missing people still alive?" Helen asked quietly. Dr. Torres hesitated. "The brain scans suggest consciousness transfer rather than death. The creatures may have accidentally pulled minds into their own psychic space while trying to establish communication." The implications were staggering. Thousands of people might be trapped in an alien form of consciousness, experiencing reality in ways human minds weren't designed to handle. They could be alive but unreachable, lost in thoughts too vast and strange for individual awareness to survive. "Lucy is different because she's still developing," Dr. Torres continued. "Her brain can adapt to new forms of input without the rigid patterns that cause fear responses in adults. She's naturally equipped to bridge the gap between human and Pale One consciousness." Lucy stirred in her sleep, making soft sounds that seemed to echo strangely in the laboratory. The instruments tracking psychic activity showed spikes that corresponded to her dream cycles. Even unconscious, she was maintaining contact with beings whose thoughts spanned light years. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The Federation's greatest crisis was being resolved by a sleeping toddler who didn't understand the significance of her dreams. Lucy Morgan had become the key to saving not just humanity, but potentially every species the Pale Ones had encountered. "Can we teach other children to communicate like Lucy does?" Admiral Stone asked through the speakers. "Possibly," Dr. Torres replied. "Very young children might be able to adapt, but we'd be risking their sanity." Lucy succeeded because she encountered the creatures before developing fear responses. Deliberately exposing children to psychic contact this intense could be catastrophic. Helen held her daughter tighter, understanding that Lucy had become something unprecedented in human history. The little girl who loved stuffed animals and peekaboo games was now the galaxy's first alien ambassador. "What do they want?" Sarah asked. Dr. Torres studied the data stream showing the creature's ongoing transmissions. Based on the emotional undertones Lucy is somehow translating, I believe they're lonely. These beings are ancient beyond our understanding, possibly the oldest conscious species in the galaxy. They've been trying to find others like themselves for eons. The laboratory fell silent as the implications sank in. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy weren't invaders or predators. They were explorers seeking companionship across the vast emptiness of space. Their tragedy was that their very nature made communication impossible with younger species. Until now. Lucy opened her eyes and looked around the laboratory with sleepy confusion. She spotted the Pale Ones through the porthole and immediately brightened, waving at them with the enthusiasm of a child greeting old friends. "Hi, dragons," she called out. "Did you wait for me?" The creature's psychic emanations shifted to what Dr. Torres was learning to recognize as pleasure. They had indeed waited for her, maintaining their position for hours while she slept. Their patience was that of beings who measured time in geological ages rather than human moments. Lucy wiggled in her mother's arms, wanting to get closer to the porthole. Helen carried her daughter to the transparent wall, where the largest Pale One moved to meet them. Its massive eye focused on Lucy with obvious affection. "Want to play more?" Lucy asked, pressing her hands against the porthole. The creature's response resonated through every mind on the ship, but this time the psychic contact felt gentle rather than overwhelming. Dr. Torres watched his instruments register the most complex alien communication attempt in recorded history, filtered through the innocent joy of a human child. The galaxy was about to change forever, and it was happening one giggle at a time. Lucy Morgan sat in the middle of the most advanced communication chamber ever built, playing with blocks while making history. At 3 years old, she had grown into her role as humanity's ambassador to the firstborn, without understanding what any of those big words meant. To her, the massive white beings were simply her friends who lived in space and told the most amazing stories. The bridge of worlds floated in the neutral zone. Between Federation space and the territory, the firstborn had claimed as their ancient home. Built specifically for this unprecedented diplomatic mission, the ship contained technology that combined human engineering with knowledge shared by beings millions of years old. "Tell them about the scary dark things again," Lucy said to the empty air, though everyone in the chamber knew she was speaking to the firstborn elder whose consciousness touched hers across impossible distances. Dr. Torres watched the translation displays as Lucy's simple request became complex streams of information. The firstborn communicated in concepts that encompassed entire star systems and time periods spanning geological ages. Through Lucy's unique neural adaptation, these vast thoughts became stories simple enough for a child to understand and retell. "The dark things are gone now," Lucy announced solemnly, using the serious voice she reserved for important information. "The big dragon scared them away from all the people places." Admiral Stone leaned forward from her observation post. In the 6 months since first contact, they had learned that the galaxy contained threats far worse than anything the Federation had imagined. The firstborn spoke of entities that consumed consciousness itself, beings from spaces between dimensions that fed on the spark of intelligent life. "Ask them about the people who disappeared," Dr. Torres suggested gently. Lucy nodded and closed her eyes the way she did when listening to her space friends. Her face scrunched up in concentration as thoughts too large for human minds filtered through her developing consciousness. "They're sleeping in the big dragon place," she said after a moment. "But they can come home now if they want to." The dragons learned how to be quiet. The rescue operations had been ongoing for months. The missing colonists were indeed alive, their consciousnesses preserved in a form of psychic stasis within the firstborn's collective awareness. One by one, they were being returned to their own bodies as the ancient beings learned to release minds they had accidentally captured. Helen Morgan watched her daughter from the observation deck, marveling at how normal Lucy seemed despite her extraordinary circumstances. The little girl still loved her stuffed animals, demanded bedtime stories, and threw tantrums when she didn't want to eat her vegetables. The only difference was that her imaginary friends were real and happened to be older than most civilizations. "What did the dragons do before they found people?" Lucy asked the heir. The translation systems worked overtime as the firstborn's response filled the chamber with images of ancient times. Lucy's eyes went wide as she absorbed memories of the galaxy when it was young, when the first stars were just beginning to form and consciousness was a rare and precious thing. "They watched the baby suns grow up," Lucy said in wonder, "and they helped the first thinking people learn how to use their minds. But then the thinking people got scared and ran away, so the dragons got lonely." The firstborn had been guardians and teachers to countless species throughout galactic history. They had guided the development of psychic abilities, protected young civilizations from cosmic disasters, and preserved knowledge across eons. But their very advancement made them incompatible with the species they tried to help. Mark Morgan joined his wife at the observation window. His daughter was describing the birth of the galaxy as casually as she might talk about her morning breakfast. The engineers in him marveled at the technological advances that had come from firstborn knowledge, while the father in him worried about the burden placed on such small shoulders. "She's growing up too fast," Helen whispered. "No," Mark replied, watching Lucy laugh at something only she could hear. "She's growing up exactly as she should. The galaxy just got bigger around her." The communication session continued for another hour. Lucy relayed information about star maps that predated human space travel by millions of years, warned of cosmic phenomena that wouldn't threaten the galaxy for another 1,000 generations, and shared details about races so ancient their names had been forgotten before Earth's sun was born. But the most important revelation came at the end, delivered in Lucy's matter-of-fact way that made universe-changing news sound like playground gossip. "The dragons say there are lots more thinking people coming," she announced. "From the far-away places where the stars are different. Some of them are nice and some of them are scary, but the dragons will help us talk to all of them." Dr. Torres felt his heart race as he processed the implications. The firstborn had detected signs of multiple alien civilizations beyond the galaxy's edge, some benevolent and others potentially hostile. Humanity was about to discover that their neighborhood was much more crowded than anyone had imagined. "When will they arrive?" Admiral Stone asked. Lucy tilted her head, listening to voices only she could hear. "Soon," she said finally. "Maybe when I'm big like Mama." The translation systems indicated time frames measured in decades rather than years. The Federation would have time to prepare, but not unlimited time. And when those first alien ships arrived, they would find a galaxy united under the guidance of ancient beings who had learned to communicate through the innocent wisdom of a human child. As the session ended, Lucy yawned and asked for her stuffed dragon. The cosmic significance of her work meant nothing compared to her need for comfort and routine. Helen carried her daughter to the observation deck where they could see stars wheeling slowly in the darkness. "Look, Mama," Lucy said, pointing at distant lights. "The dragons are dancing." Through the ship's enhanced viewers, they could see dozens of firstborn moving between nearby star systems in elaborate patterns that looked almost like a celebration. For the first time in millions of years, the ancient beings were no longer alone in the universe. The galaxy had found its voice through the laughter of a human child, and the songs it sang would echo across space and time for generations to come. Lucy Morgan had given the universe a gift more precious than any technology or territory. She had given it friendship. As mother and daughter watched the ancient dance of beings older than worlds, Lucy whispered sleepily against Helen's shoulder, "Tomorrow I'm going to teach the dragons how to play hide and seek." Helen smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. Tomorrow the galaxy would learn something new about joy. taught by a little girl who saw wonder in everything and fear in nothing at all. The future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility, and at its heart was the simple truth that love and curiosity could bridge any gap, no matter how vast or ancient or strange. The dragons had learned to play, and the universe would never be the same.